In the spring of 1887, when the snow finally released its hold on the Gallatin Valley of Montana Territory, the people who rode out to assess the damage came back quieter than they had left. Not the quiet of relief. The quiet of men who have seen something they cannot quite fit into any category they already have. The cattle were everywhere. Not in the pastures, not in the pens, not where cattle are supposed to be. They were in the fields and along the fence lines and in the coulees, where they had drifted looking for shelter that did not exist. 23 ranches in the valley had borrowed against their herds to buy more land and more cattle and more of everything that the good years had made seem inevitable. By the time the snow melted, those ranches were gone. Not struggling. Gone. The banks moved quickly in the spring of 1887. The way banks move when the numbers have already been decided. And the only remaining question is the paperwork. 90% of the cattle in Gallatin Valley died in that winter. Men who had been worth $100,000 in October were worth nothing in April. The boom that had built Millstone Crossing and a dozen towns like it across Montana Territory turned out to have been built on the assumption that winters would remain reasonable. That assumption had been incorrect, and in a small cabin 2 miles east of Millstone Crossing in a place that no one from town visited much because the woman who lived there had a reputation for peculiarity, 11 families had survived the worst winter in the memory of the territory. 31 children had eaten through the coldest months because of what was buried under the floor of that cabin. Not one of them had gone to bed without food. Not one of them had lost a family member to the cold or to hunger. The woman who had made that possible was 30 years old. Her name was Marta Elgren. And the people of Millstone Crossing had spent the better part of 1886 calling her crazy. Let me tell you about Marta Elgren because she deserves to be told about in the right order, starting from the thing that made her what she was. Not the cabin, not the preparations. The thing before all of that. The thing that happened on February 23, 1885, which is the date that divided her life into 2 entirely different stories. Eric Elgren had been a good husband in the ways that mattered most in Montana Territory in 1885. He was steady. He was not a drinking man. He got up before sunrise and worked until he could not see. And he did not complain about the work, because he had come from Sweden with the understanding that hard work in new country was the price of a life worth having. And he was willing to pay that price without negotiating the terms. He and Marta had come to Montana in 1882 with $240 a wagon, and the particular optimism that the land office pamphlets were very good at producing. In people who had not yet seen a Montana winter, the pamphlets described the summers accurately enough. The summers were real and generous and full of the kind of light that makes a person believe they have made the right decision. The pamphlets did not describe February with the same fidelity. Their first 2 winters were hard, but manageable. They stored food each fall, though not as much as they would need to know they needed. And they supplemented with hunting when the weather allowed, and with careful rationing when it did not. They were young and strong, and the hardship had the quality of something temporary, something that would ease as the farm developed and the cattle multiplied, and the life they had imagined began to resemble the life they were actually living. By the fall of 1884, they had $43 in a tin box under the floorboard, and a small herd of 7 cattle, and a root cellar that held what seemed in October like a reasonable supply of food for 2 people through a normal winter. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was not a normal winter. The snow started in November and stayed. The temperature dropped in December and did not recover. By January, Eric and Marta were rationing carefully, measuring the flour and the dried beans and the preserved vegetables with the attention of people who have begun to understand that what they have may not be enough. By February, the understanding had moved past the conditional. The flour barrel was down to the last quarter. The dried meat was gone. What remained in the root cellar was a calculation that did not work out to spring. On the morning of February 23rd, Eric told Marta he was going hunting. He said it the way he said things he had already decided without discussion, because discussion would have required her to argue against something that was also her only idea. He took his rifle and his warmest coat and his good boots. He told her he would be back before dark. A storm came up 2 hours after he left. Not the kind of storm that announces itself with a gradual darkening of the sky. The kind that drops out of nowhere in Montana February, a wall of white that arrives between one breath and the next, and turns the familiar landscape into something with no landmarks and no directions and no mercy. Eric did not come home before dark. He did not come home after dark. Marta kept the fire going through that night and the next and the one after that, burning the furniture she could spare and the fence posts she could reach through the drifts, and she waited. The storm broke on the third day. The temperature rose enough to make movement possible. Marta went out into the white silence and walked in the direction she knew he had gone, and she found him 2 miles from the cabin in a shallow coulee where he had taken shelter against the wind. He had been dead for 2 days. The cold had done what cold does quickly and without drama when a person's body heat is no longer sufficient to counter it. She was 29 years old. She was in the 2nd month of her first pregnancy. She had enough food in the cabin to last perhaps 3 more weeks. She buried him when the ground thawed enough to accept a shovel, which was not for some time. In the weeks between finding him and burying him, she lost the child. The doctor in Millstone Crossing, when she was finally able to reach him, said it was the stress and the grief and the nutritional deficiency that had accumulated through the rationing months. He said these things with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned that explaining causes does not reduce grief, and may in fact increase it. By the time spring came to the Gallatin Valley in 1885, Marta Elgren had no husband, no child, no cattle, no money beyond the $43 in the tin box, and a root cellar that had failed her in the one way that mattered. She had a cabin. She had a piece of land. She had the knowledge of exactly what it costs to be wrong about how much food you need. She spent that spring and summer the way a person spends a season, when they have decided that the thing that destroyed them will not be permitted to happen again. She planted a garden 3 times the size of what she needed. She broke new ground on the north side of the property that had not been broken before, working from before sunrise until she could not see the soil in front of her. She planted potatoes and turnips and carrots and cabbages in rows that covered more of her claim than she had ever cultivated. More than one woman could reasonably tend more than common sense suggested was necessary. She took in laundry from the houses in Millstone Crossing. She mended clothes. She did any work that anyone would pay her for, and she paid herself in provisions rather than cash whenever the transaction allowed it. By September of 1885, she had accumulated $60 and enough dried goods to last a careful person through a normal winter. She did not store it in the root cellar. The root cellar was what had failed, not because of the design, but because of the depth. 8 inches below the surface, the temperature in a Montana winter drops, with the surface temperature and preserved food in a shallow cellar, is subject to the same freeze that kills everything else. What she needed was not a root cellar. What she needed was a pit. She dug it in June of 1886, when the ground was soft enough to work, 8 feet down into the Montana clay that held its temperature year-round at something between 40 and 55 degrees. Not warm enough to spoil food, not cold enough to freeze it, the temperature of a cave of deep earth of the part of the world that the surface weather cannot reach. She lined it with straw and sawdust and wooden planks, building layers of insulation between the food and the soil, creating a storage environment that would hold through whatever the winter above it chose to do. When she was finished, she had a pit beneath her cabin floor, with capacity for 600 pounds of provisions, accessible through a trapdoor. She cut in the floorboards near the south wall. Then she filled it. The summer of 1886 was the summer that Millstone Crossing began to notice Marta Elgren in a new way. She had been noticed before in the way that a young widow living alone is always noticed in a small town, with a mixture of sympathy and speculation, and the particular attention that communities pay to people whose situations represent cautionary possibilities. But in the summer of 1886, the noticing changed quality. It became something more active. She was buying potatoes from every farm in the valley. Not a sack here and a sack there. Quantities. She was buying turnips and cabbages and dried beans in amounts that exceeded what a single person could consume in any reasonable projection of time. She was at the feed and supply store buying salt in bulk, the kind of quantities you buy when you are preserving meat for a large family or a small community. She was hunting through June and July and August, shooting deer and processing them herself, cutting the meat into strips and salting and smoking it in the small smokehouse she had built from scrap lumber behind her cabin. People talked. People always talk in small towns. And the talking is not always unkind, but it is always present, and it shapes the air that everyone breathes. The story that took hold in Millstone Crossing in the summer of 1886 was that the Swedish widow had been broken by grief and was expressing that brokenness in the form of irrational food hoarding. This was not a story invented by anyone in particular. It assembled itself from observations and inferences and the natural human tendency to fit behavior into the nearest available category of explanation. Lucinda Hargrove gave the story its most prominent telling. Lucinda Hargrove was the wife of Benton Hargrove, who owned 50,000 head of cattle on 100,000 acres of rangeland in the Gallatin Valley, and had recently finished building a house with imported Boston furniture and Boston wallpaper, and a parlor that was discussed in Millstone Crossing, with the mixture of admiration and resentment that fine things produce in communities where most people do not have them. Lucinda had come from a family of some standing in Massachusetts, and had brought with her to Montana Territory a set of convictions about the proper ordering of civilization that she held with the serene confidence of someone who has never had occasion to seriously test them. She was not a cruel woman. That is worth saying clearly, because what happened between her and Marta Elgren is sometimes told as a story about cruelty, and that is not quite accurate. Lucinda Hargrove was a woman who had decided on the basis of her experience and her education, and the evidence available to her that the world was fundamentally manageable by people who approached it correctly, that trains and telegraphs and the expanding infrastructure of American civilization had created a situation in which the old fears the famine fears the 7 months of winter fears. The fears that had driven people from the old countries were no longer rational responses to actual conditions. She rode out to Marta's cabin on a Tuesday afternoon in July of 1886 in her good carriage with the specific intention of saying something helpful. Marta was in the yard when she arrived, cutting the last of a deer into strips for drying her hands red from the work, the air around her carrying the smell of blood and salt and the coming preservation. Lucinda stepped down from the carriage with the careful movement of a woman whose dress was not designed for unpaved ground, and looked at the scene with an expression that she probably did not know she was making. Marta looked up. She did not stop working. What Lucinda said was not said with malice. She said that people in town were beginning to worry. that Marta had been buying food in quantities that exceeded any rational need, that the valley had trains now and supply wagons, and a civilization that did not require its inhabitants to stockpile food like animals preparing for a siege. She said the word crazy with the softening that people apply to words they know are hard, but she said it. Marta's hands kept moving. She salted another strip of meat and laid it on the drying rack before she looked up and answered. She told Lucinda about finding Eric. She said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, just stating the facts as they had occurred. The storm, the 2 days, the 2 miles, what she had found in the coulee. She said that she had understood when she found him exactly what the root of the problem was, and she did not intend to repeat it. Lucinda's expression shifted, but only for a moment. Then she gathered herself in the way people gather themselves when an argument they have come to make meets an obstacle they had not prepared for. And she continued. She said this was Montana, not Sweden. She said the hard years were behind them. She said civilization had arrived in the Gallatin Valley, and civilization meant that a woman alone did not need to salt a year's worth of meat and bury 600 pounds of food under her floor to feel safe. When she drove away, Marta went back to work. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something that the room did not know? And the room's confidence in its own correctness was so complete that there was no gap in it for your knowledge to enter. Have you ever watched someone explain away the very evidence that contradicted their explanation with such smooth assurance that you could almost believe they were right and you were wrong? That is what it felt like in the summer of 1886 to be Marta Elgren. But Lucinda Hargrove did not stop at saying what she said to Marta. That was where the thing changed from opinion to action. In the weeks that followed her visit to the cabin, Lucinda spoke to people in Millstone Crossing. She spoke to Aldous Pembry, who ran the feed and supply store, and suggested to him that selling to Marta in bulk was contributing to a problem rather than helping a neighbor. She spoke to several of the farmers who had been selling Marta their excess potato and turnip harvest, and she suggested that perhaps those provisions could be better directed toward the community supply, rather than one woman's private stockpile. She did not issue instructions. She was not in a position to issue instructions. She simply expressed concern in the particular way of a woman who is accustomed to her concerns being taken seriously. And some people took them seriously. Aldous Pembry began adding a modest markup to Marta's bulk orders that he did not apply to other customers. 2 of the farmers stopped returning her inquiries. A third told her directly that he had decided to sell his excess stock to the cooperative rather than to individuals. Marta did not argue with any of them. She had not expected this specific complication, but she had been a person who prepared for complications in general, and she adjusted. She began riding further, 20 miles north to a Crow trading post, where the Hargrove name carried less weight, 30 miles west to farms in a different valley where no one had heard about the crazy Swedish widow with the hole in her floor. She bought what she needed from people who did not know her history, and therefore had no story about her to maintain. She came home each time with the mules loaded, and her jaw set, in the way of a woman who has learned that the world will require more effort than it should, and has decided to provide that effort anyway. In September of 1886, Grandmother Lindqvist made the journey from Helena to visit her granddaughter. She was 83 years old. She had made the trip from her son's farm near Helena by wagon, a 2-day journey that she had insisted on making without being asked, and that her son had permitted only after extracting promises about the pace of travel. She arrived at Marta's cabin on a Tuesday morning in mid-September. Moving with the careful deliberateness of extreme age, her eyes clouded to the point where she could see shapes, but not details. Her hands twisted into the permanent curve of decades of work. Her mind was not clouded. Her mind was the sharpest thing in any room she entered. She stood in the cabin doorway and smelled the air inside the dried meat hanging from the rafters, the preserved vegetables on the shelves, the cool smell from the pit beneath the floor. And she stood there for a long moment just breathing it before she said anything. Then she said it was right. She used the Swedish word first, and then the English one as if she wanted to be certain there was no ambiguity. Right. What Marta was doing was right. She sat at the kitchen table and told Marta about 1867, about the winter that had started in October and had not released until the following May, about what people had done when the food ran out. She did not tell the worst of it, because some of what she had seen in 1867 was not a thing she would put into words even 50 years later. But she told enough. Her mother, her two younger sisters, the particular look that the faces of starving people develop, which is different from the look of hungry people in a way that anyone who has seen it will recognize, and anyone who has not seen it will hope they never have occasion to identify. She said that she had been 30 years old in 1867. She said she had watched things happen that she had sworn. Watching them she would never permit to happen to people she was responsible for. She said she had kept that promise through 50 years and 2 countries, and the crossing of an ocean with 3 children, and the building of a life in a new place, with the specific intention of putting as much distance as possible between her descendants and the things she had watched happen to her family. She said to store for 7 months. She said not to let anyone tell Marta that was too much. She said it was not nearly enough, but it was a start. Then she asked to see the pit. Marta lifted the trapdoor and held the lantern down into the darkness, and the old woman leaned over and breathed the cool air that rose from the stored provisions below. She nodded slowly in the manner of someone checking a thing against a memory and finding that the thing matches. "This is how we did it in the old country," she said. "Not by trusting the weather, not by trusting the government, not by trusting the neighbors, by trusting what we put away." She stayed 3 days. She slept in Marta's bed, and Marta slept on the floor near the stove without minding it, and in the evenings they sat at the kitchen table and the old woman talked, while Marta listened with the attention of someone who understands that what is being transmitted is not just stories but instructions, not just history, but preparation. Before she left, Grandmother Lindqvist gripped Marta's hand with the surprising strength that old people sometimes have. The strength that comes not from muscle, but from intention. She held it for a moment. Then she got in the wagon and went back to Helena. Marta stood in the yard and watched the wagon until it disappeared around the curve of the road, and then she went back inside and did something she had not told anyone she was doing. She opened her journal, the one she kept in the drawer beneath the tin box where the money was, and she turned to a page she had been working on since early summer. The page had names on it. 8 families from the area around Millstone Crossing. For each family she had written the number of people in the household, the number of children, her estimate of what they had stored based on what she could observe from the road, or from conversations at the supply store, or from the ordinary knowledge that accumulates in a small community over time. And beside each estimate a number that represented in Marta's careful arithmetic the shortfall she expected each family to face if the winter was as long as it could be. She had been buying food for all of them, not just for herself. The 600 pounds in the pit was not a single woman's store against a single winter. It was a calculation made for 11 households based on the assumption that the winter of 1886 would be the kind of winter that her grandmother had just spent 3 evenings describing. She had not told anyone this, not because she was certain she was right about the winter. She might be wrong. The winter might be mild and short, and she would sit on a mountain of provisions in the spring, and the people who called her crazy would have the satisfaction of being correct. She could live with that. She had been wrong about things before, and she had found that being wrong was considerably preferable to being right in the way she had been right in February of 1885. She closed the journal and put it back in the drawer. Outside, the September light was still warm, the kind of warmth that Montana produces in the fall, as if to apologize for what is coming. The garden was in the last stages of harvest. The drying racks beside the smokehouse held the last of the season's venison. The mules were in the small pen behind the cabin, fed and content. Below the floor, 600 pounds of food waited in the dark, and the constant cool patient as the earth itself. If you have enjoyed this story so far, leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from today. And if you have ever done the hard work of preparation while the people around you shook their heads and called you foolish, this story is for you. Stay with me, because what happened in November of 1886 and what happened to the 50,000 head of cattle in Benton Hargrove's fields, and what happened to Lucinda Hargrove on a cold night in the middle of February, none of that is a story that ends the way anyone expected when they were laughing in the summer. The summer always makes fools of the people who think they understand the winter. The winter of 1886 was not interested in what anyone thought they understood. The snow came on the 9th of November, 1886, and it came without the usual warning, not the gradual darkening that precedes a normal storm, not the particular quality of silence that experienced Montana farmers had learned to read as the sky's way of announcing its intentions. It came the way the worst things come quickly, and without negotiation a foot of white that covered the Gallatin Valley between the morning and the afternoon and showed no sign of having said everything it intended to say. Marta stood at her cabin window that evening and watched the snow fall in the lantern light, and did not feel the thing that the people in Millstone Crossing felt, which was the mild irritation of an early winter, followed by the comfortable assumption that it would pass. She felt something quieter and more specific. She felt the particular sensation of a thing you have prepared for arriving on schedule, the way a person feels when they have been told a difficult piece of news. And then the difficult thing actually occurs, and the arrival of the expected thing is both worse and less surprising than either of those qualities alone. She checked the trap door that evening. She lifted it and held the lantern down into the pit and looked at what was there. 600 pounds, the potatoes in their crates, the turnips and carrots and cabbages packed in sawdust, the dried beans in their sacks, the venison and elk stripped and salted and smoked to leather hardness, the preserved fruit in its sealed jars, the flour and the cornmeal and the salt. She stood there for a moment with the cool air rising around her, the smell of earth and preservation, and everything she had spent the summer building. And then she lowered the door and went to bed. The snow did not stop the next week. More came the week after that. By December, there were 3 feet on the ground, and the Gallatin Valley had taken on the quality of a place that has decided to become something other than what it usually was. The temperature dropped with the snow, 20 below by the second week of December, 30 below by Christmas. It was on a night in late December that the trees began to explode. Not all of them. Not at once. But through the deep cold of a still night when the temperature had dropped to 35 below, and the air had the crystalline quality of extreme cold. The sap inside certain trees froze faster than the wood could accommodate. The pressure built until the only resolution was structural, and the trunk split apart with sounds like rifle shots, sharp and clean, and carrying a long distance in the cold air. Marta woke to those sounds more than once in December and January, lying still in the dark and listening, counting them the way you count thunder to estimate the distance of a storm. They were not distant. They were close, the trees along the fence line and in the coulee below the cabin. The sounds of the winter making itself known through the most basic physics of expansion and containment. In Millstone Crossing, the coal ran low by January. The supply wagons that should have brought the winter's provisions were not getting through. The roads that connected Millstone Crossing to the larger supply networks had become impassable under drifts that reached the eaves of the lower buildings, and the railroad, which Lucinda Hargrove had cited as evidence that civilization had arrived in the Gallatin Valley, had a stretch of track buried under 12 feet of packed snow, 40 miles to the south, that no plow had yet reached. At the Hargrove Ranch, the situation was developing in the way that situations develop when the assumptions underlying them are proven incorrect by events that do not care about assumptions. Benton Hargrove had 50,000 head of cattle in October. By January, the number that had not yet frozen was somewhere between 8 and 12,000, and those animals were dying at a rate that could be calculated but not stopped. The mathematics of what this meant were not complicated. Benton Hargrove had borrowed $180,000 against his herd to expand the operation in 1885, when the cattle prices were high and the bankers were eager, and the future looked the way futures always look when they have not yet become the present. $180,000 at the interest rates that Montana territorial banks were charging in 1885 against a herd that was now worth a fraction of what it had been when the loan was made. The men who rode out to push the living cattle toward shelter came back with the specific silence of people who have seen something they do not want to describe. The cattle that had frozen were everywhere, in the fields, in the coulees, along the fence lines where they had drifted, looking for a break in the wind that was not there. The ones still alive were thin in the way that animals get thin when the cold is taking more than the feed is replacing, a visible consumption happening in real time that no amount of hay could fully counter. Benton Hargrove sat at the Boston desk in the Boston furnished study of his house and looked at numbers that did not improve with looking at them. His wife stood at the parlor window and watched the snow fall on what had been 100,000 acres of prosperous rangeland, and she thought about things she had said in July, and she thought about the cabin 2 miles east of town, and she did not yet do anything about what she was thinking. The first family came to Marta's door on the 14th of January, the Hendersons. 6 children, the oldest 12 and the youngest not quite 2. Frank Henderson had been a cautious man by temperament, but caution in the Gallatin Valley in 1886 had meant storing what seemed like enough, and not what Marta had calculated was enough. And the difference between those two quantities had become clear to him in the second week of January when he counted what remained and divided it by the number of mouths, and arrived at a date that was well short of spring. He came alone first in the early morning before the children were awake. He stood at Marta's door with his hat in his hands and explained the situation in the straightforward way of a man who has decided that the dignity of not asking is worth less than the practical result of asking. He had 6 children. He had perhaps 2 weeks of food left. He did not know what he would do after that. Marta opened the trap door. She had calculated for the Hendersons in her journal. 6 children plus 2 adults, estimated shortfall of 4 weeks of provisions. She had been storing for this. She filled a sack with potatoes and another with dried venison, and a third with the dried beans that were the most efficient way she knew to deliver calories in a small volume, and she set them on the table. "Come back in a week," she said. "There will be more." He looked at the provisions on the table and then at the trapdoor, and then at her, and something moved in his face that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude, and was something more complicated than either the expression of a man who has just been shown that the world contains a resource he had not known to count on. He took the food and went home to his children. The Millers came 3 days later, then the Johnsons, then the Weathers family, who had a boy named Callum who was 9 years old, and who came along with his parents because there was no one to leave him with, and who stood in Marta's cabin with the wide-eyed attention of a child who is storing something rather than just seeing it. He watched everything, the trapdoor being lifted, the provisions being measured and distributed, the careful arithmetic of a woman who was feeding more people than she had originally planned for adjusting the portions with the precision of someone who has run the calculations many times and knows exactly what the margins are. Marta noted all of this without remarking on it. There was work to be done, and she did it, and the boy's attention was not a disruption. By the end of January, 8 families had come. Marta fed all of them. Have you ever given away the last of something you needed? Not because anyone demanded it of you, not because there was a rule or an expectation that required it, but because the alternative, the keeping, the protecting of your own supply while you watched what happened to people who had less, was something you could not arrange yourself to do. There is a particular kind of person who encounters that choice and makes it one way, and a particular kind who makes it the other way. And the difference between them is not always legible from the outside. It does not announce itself in how a person looks, or what they say, or what they have accomplished. It shows up in what they do when the trapdoor is open and the provisions are going down, and the arithmetic is getting tighter. Marta knew the arithmetic was getting tighter. She had been running the numbers every evening since the second family arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with her journal open, writing the same calculation in different forms, as if a different form might produce a different result. It did not produce a different result. The result was the same every time. She had enough food for herself for 7 months, as her grandmother had instructed. She had planned for the 8 families she had identified as most vulnerable, stored for their probable shortfall, built her provisions to a level that she had believed was sufficient for that purpose. But the winter was not following her plan. It was following its own plan, which included more families than she had estimated, and a duration that was beginning to press against the outer edge of what she had stored for. On the evening after the 9th family came, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The Strand family had arrived that afternoon, parents and 3 children having walked 2 miles through drifts, because the horse had died in December. The father had carried the youngest child on his back for the last mile. They were the 9th family. They were not on Marta's original list. She had fed them. She had not hesitated at the door or made any calculation visible to them. She had opened the trapdoor and brought up what they needed, and sent them back with enough for a week, because that is what she did, and there was no version of herself in which she did otherwise. But when they were gone and the cabin was quiet, she opened the journal and looked at the numbers. 38%. That was what remained in the pit after the Strand family's provisions were packed and carried. 38% of 600 pounds. 228 pounds of mixed provisions spread across 9 families and herself. With the spring thaw at least 10 weeks away on an optimistic accounting and no particular reason to be optimistic, she was not afraid of dying. That is worth saying plainly. She had been in a situation where dying was a real possibility in February of 1885, and she had come out of it with a relationship to her own mortality that was different from what it had been before. She was not casual about it. She did not want to die. But the fear that sat in her chest that January evening was not the fear of her own death. It was the fear of running out before the children were safe. She looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she did what she had been avoiding doing for 2 weeks, which was to draw a hard line on the page below her own daily ration and reduce it. Not eliminate it. She was not useful to anyone dead, and the families who were coming to her door needed her functional and present and capable of making decisions. But she could give less to herself than she had been giving and redirect that portion to the families with the youngest children. And the calculation revised downward bought her 11 days. 11 days was not enough. But 11 days was 11 days, and she had learned to value what was available rather than mourn what was not. She closed the journal and went to bed. The cold continued through February with the persistence of something that has not yet made its point. 40 below for 4 consecutive days in the second week of the month. Temperatures that the old-timers in Millstone Crossing said they had not seen in their time in the valley. The firewood situation in town had become serious. Families were burning furniture and outbuildings, and in one case a family burned the floor of their house, pulling up the planks board by board and feeding them into the stove, sleeping on the bare earth below, because the bare earth was warmer than the air above it. At the Hargrove Ranch, Benton Hargrove had stopped going out to check on the cattle. There was no longer much point in checking. What could be seen from the window of the house was sufficient to understand the situation, and the situation did not improve with closer examination. The last count made by his foreman on a day when the temperature rose enough to permit movement put the surviving herd at perhaps 3,000 animals down from 50,000 and falling. $180,000 of debt, 3,000 cattle, a house full of Boston furniture that was worth considerably less than the sum of what it had cost to bring it to Montana territory, and considerably more than anything else Benton Hargrove currently owned. He sat with these numbers in his study and did not emerge for most of February. Lucinda Hargrove managed the house. She directed the rationing of the household provisions with the competent efficiency of a woman who had grown up understanding that a house does not run itself, even when it appears to. She had 3 children. She had servants who needed feeding. She had a husband who was sitting in his study with the expression of a man who is doing arithmetic in his head and finding that the numbers do not improve. She had in the back of her mind the memory of a Tuesday afternoon in July and a woman in a yard cutting venison, and words she had said that she had not at the time thought she would have occasion to regret. The provisions in the Hargrove household pantry were running low by the second week of February. Not gone. Not yet. But low in the way that makes the person managing them begin to see the bottom of things in a new light. The bottom of the flour barrel. The bottom of the preserved fruit jars. The bottom of the salted pork barrel that had seemed so full in October. Lucinda did her calculations. She was a precise woman. She had been educated in Boston in the 1860s at a time, and in a manner that included arithmetic among the useful skills. And she applied that education now to the problem in front of her, and arrived at a date that was approximately 3 weeks before any reasonable estimate of the spring thaw. She stood in the pantry for a long time with a candle looking at what was on the shelves. Then she looked at the window, which showed nothing but darkness and blowing snow. Then she went to bed and lay awake for a long time and thought about what she was going to do. On the evening of February 19th, Lucinda Hargrove dressed in her warmest coat and her heaviest boots, and wrapped a wool scarf around her head, and walked out of her house. Not in her carriage. The carriage could not manage the drifts. Not on horseback. The horse that remained was needed for emergencies. She walked 2 miles through February in the Gallatin Valley in drifts that came to her waist in the worst sections in cold that took the moisture from her breath and crystallized it on the wool scarf before it could disperse. It took her nearly 2 hours. She had not walked 2 miles in conditions like this in her life. She was a woman who rode. But the horse was for emergencies, and she had decided somewhere in the arithmetic of the pantry that this was not an emergency in the way that would justify that. Or perhaps she had decided that the particular nature of this errand required that she arrive on foot. That arriving on foot was the only honest way to arrive. Marta's cabin had a light in the window. Of course it did. Marta always had a light in the window because the families who came to her came at all hours, and she left the light so they could find it. Lucinda stood at the door for a moment in the cold. She did not knock immediately. She stood there with the wind pressing at her back and the light in the window in front of her, and she thought about July and about the words she had said to Aldous Pembry at the feed and supply store, the suggestions she had made, the conversations that had required Marta to ride 20 extra miles in summer heat, to buy what she needed from people who did not know the story about the crazy Swedish widow. Then she knocked. Not loudly. She did not knock the way a person knocks when they are announcing themselves. She knocked the way a person knocks when they are not entirely sure they deserve to have the door opened. Marta opened it. She looked at Lucinda for a moment without speaking, at the frost on the wool scarf, at the way the cold had taken the color from her face and replaced it with something else, at the Boston coat that was warm enough for a Boston winter and was doing its best in a Montana one. Lucinda said quietly that her children had not eaten since the previous evening. That was all she said. There was no preamble. There was no apology, though what she had not said carried its own weight in the silence. My children haven't eaten since yesterday. 5 words and the weight behind them, which was considerable. Marta looked at her for a moment longer. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. Lucinda came inside. The warmth of the cabin was something physical, something that had to be adjusted to coming in from what she had just walked through. She stood near the door for a moment and simply breathed it, the warmth and the smell of dried meat and the particular smell of a place where food has been carefully stored and carefully managed and carefully given away. Marta went to the trap door. She lifted it. She went down the ladder and came back up with potatoes and dried venison and a jar of the preserved pears that she had been rationing most carefully, because the children seemed to need them most. She set these things on the table. Enough for a week, she said. Come back next week and there will be more. Lucinda looked at the food on the table. She looked at the trap door. She looked at the shelves where the provisions were arranged with the orderly precision of a woman who knows exactly what she has and has always known exactly what she has. She did not say thank you with words. She picked up the provisions and held them against her chest with both arms, the way you hold something that you understand the value of. And she looked at Marta for a moment with an expression that had several things in it, none of which she put into words. Then she went back out into the February dark. Marta stood at the window and watched the lantern Lucinda carried until it disappeared into the blowing snow on the road to the Hargrove Ranch. Then she went to the table and sat down with her journal. She had been the 10th family. She opened to the page with the list and wrote the Hargroves at the bottom. 2 adults, 3 children. Estimated shortfall. She looked at the number in the pit column and looked at the number in the need column and held them against each other for a long time. Then she crossed out the line she had drawn under her own daily ration and drew it lower. Outside, February continued in the way of a thing that has committed to a position and intends to hold it. The cold did not relent. The snow did not stop. The temperatures that the old-timers had said they had not seen in their years in the valley held through the end of the month and into the first week of March. The trees that had not yet exploded continued to explode on the coldest nights, and Marta continued to lie in the dark and count the sounds and think about the numbers. An 11th family came in the first week of March, and then a 12th inquiry. Not a family, but an old man who lived alone on the North Fork and had heard through the chain of people that information travels through in winters that force everyone indoors, that there was a woman with food. He was 70 years old, and he had been eating the grain he had stored for his horse because the horse had died in January, and the grain was all that was left. Marta fed him too. She gave him enough to make it to the next visit. She recorded him in the journal. She adjusted the calculation. The numbers were very tight by March. They were not impossible, but they were tight in the way that requires perfect management and no unexpected demands. And unexpected demands have a way of arriving regardless of whether the management is perfect. On a night in the second week of March, when the wind had died enough to make the cold feel almost gentle by comparison to what had come before, Marta sat at the kitchen table after everyone had gone, and she was alone with the journal and the numbers. She had been awake for most of the previous 2 nights, not from anxiety exactly, though anxiety was present, but from the specific alertness of a mind that is doing calculations continuously and waking whenever the calculation produces a result worth examining. She was 30 years old. She had been a widow for 2 years. She had spent the summer breaking ground and salting meat and riding 30 miles to buy turnips from people who did not know her name. She had dug 8 feet into Montana clay with a steel bar in her own hands and built a storage system that was now feeding 12 families through the worst winter in the memory of the valley. She had been called crazy by a woman who had spent the summer trying to convince the town's merchants not to sell to her. And that woman had knocked on her door in February, and she had opened it, because opening it was the only thing she knew how to be. She pressed both palms flat on the table the way she had pressed them against Eric's cold face in the coulee in February of 1885, and she held them there and thought about the numbers one more time. Then she looked at the calendar on the wall. March 13th. The first thaw in a normal year came somewhere between late April and early May. The question of whether this was a normal year had been answered many times over by this point. Grandmother Lindqvist had said 7 months. The snow had started on November 9th. 7 months from November 9th was June 9th. She had planned for April. She had not planned for June. There was a difference in the pit below her feet between what she had planned for and what June required. And that difference was the number she sat with longest on that March night, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath it, hoping the underneath is different from what you expect. It was not different. She picked up her pencil and drew a line through her own ration completely. Not reduced. Eliminated. For the next week, she would eat what was left when everything else had been distributed, whatever that was. Whatever remained after the 12 families and the old man on the North Fork had been given what they needed. She knew what that would be. She had done the calculation. It was not comfortable, but it was survivable, and survivable was the standard she had set herself in February of 1885 and had not revised downward since. She closed the journal. She went to the window. Outside, the February stars had given way to the slightly softer stars of March, and the snow on the ground reflected enough of their light to make the yard visible. The drying racks empty now. The smokehouse cold, the mules in their pen standing close together for warmth, in the way animals stand when the world has been harder than expected, and the proximity of another living thing is a form of argument against the cold. Spring was somewhere out there. She could not see it yet. But she had been in Montana long enough to know that the things you cannot see in March are often closer than they appear, and that the ground which looks in March like it intends to remain frozen forever has its own plans that it keeps independent of what the surface weather chooses to do. She had stored for 7 months because her grandmother had told her to store for 7 months. And her grandmother had told her that because a winter in 1867 had lasted 7 months and taken people she loved. And the lesson of those people, the lesson that ran through 2 generations and across an ocean, was that the winter does not adjust itself to what you have stored. You store for the winter that is possible, not the winter that is usual. She had done that. She had done it while people called her crazy, and while the woman who called her crazy loudest had worked to make it harder. She had done it with $43 in a steel bar and her own hands in the summer, after the worst year of her life. Whether it was enough she would know in April, or in May, or in June if it came to that. She turned from the window and went to bed. The thaw came in the 3rd week of April, not all at once. It never comes all at once in Montana. It comes the way mercy comes after a long difficulty, incrementally, and without announcement. A degree warmer one morning, a small patch of bare ground, appearing at the south face of a slope where the sun hits longest. The sound of water moving somewhere under the snow, before the snow has given any visual indication that it intends to move. You hear the thaw before you see it. The land makes a different sound when it is beginning to release. Marta heard it on the morning of April 18th. She was at the window before first light, the way she had been at the window every morning since November. And she heard beneath the usual silence of deep cold, a faint and distant sound of water moving somewhere in the coulee below the cabin. Not much. Not enough to mean anything to anyone who had not been listening for it for 5 months, but enough. She stood at the window for a long time and listened to that sound. The snow did not melt quickly. It did not melt the way people who have not lived through a hard Montana winter imagine it melts in a clean and rapid transition from one season to the next. It melted grudgingly and unevenly, retreating from the south-facing slopes. First, while the north-facing ones held their white for weeks more, pulling back from the fence lines and the road, before it gave up the fields, leaving the landscape in a prolonged intermediate state that was neither fully winter nor anything that could yet be called spring. But it was melting. That was the fact that mattered. By the end of April, the road into Millstone Crossing was passable on horseback. By the 2nd week of May, wagons could make it. By the last week of May, the ground had released enough of the frost to show what it had been holding all winter, which was the full accounting of what the cold had done to the Gallatin Valley. The cattle were everywhere. They had been everywhere since January, frozen where they fell. But the snow had covered them, had made the landscape seem merely white and empty, rather than white and full of the evidence of catastrophe. As the snow pulled back, the evidence appeared. In the fields and along the fence lines and in the coulees and at the bases of the hills where they had drifted, looking for shelter. Thousands of them, tens of thousands across the valley. The great die-up, as people would eventually come to call it, though that name would come later when the full accounting had been done, and a word was needed for a number that resisted comprehension. 23 ranches in Gallatin Valley had borrowed to expand in the boom years of 1884 and 1885. 23 ranches were gone by the spring of 1887, not struggling, not reduced. Gone in the specific way that means the bank has already made its calculation, and the papers have already been drawn up, and the only remaining question is how much time the family needs to gather. What can be moved before the property changes hands? The territorial newspaper, when it published again in May after its winter hiatus, ran an accounting of the losses that took up the entire front page and continued for 3 pages inside. 90% of the cattle in the valley, men who had been worth $100,000 in October, worth nothing in April. The boom that had seemed so permanent, that had seemed so obviously and irreversibly, The direction of things in Montana Territory turned out to have been contingent on an assumption about winters that one winter had been sufficient to disprove. Millstone Crossing counted its dead in the weeks after the thaw. 6 men who had not come through the winter. 4 of them from circumstances directly related to cold and hunger. 2 of them from the kind of despair that comes when a man who has built his life on a particular vision of the future watches that vision become impossible. The town did not discuss the second category openly. It recorded those deaths in the register with causes that did not require explanation, and moved on with the particular practical efficiency of communities that have learned that extended mourning is a luxury that the living cannot always afford. Benton Hargrove was not among the dead. He had come close, not to the cold, but to the other thing, the despair category in the deepest weeks of February, when the numbers in his study had reduced themselves to a clarity that was very hard to look at. His wife had come back from the cabin on the East Road on that February night, with food and with something else, something harder to name, some shift in how she understood what had been happening around her. And she had gone into the study and sat across from her husband at the Boston desk and told him in the direct way that she had always been capable of when directness was what was needed, that his children were not going to watch their father make the choice that some of his neighbors were making. He had looked at her for a long time. Then he had nodded. They had sold the Boston furniture in April. Not all of it, but most of it. The parlor that had been discussed in Millstone Crossing with such a mixture of admiration and resentment was not empty by spring, but it was considerably less full, and what remained in it was functional rather than decorative. The furniture of people who have revised their understanding of what furniture is for. Benton Hargrove took a position with a supply company in May that paid a salary and did not require him to bet everything he had on the assumption that the weather would remain cooperative. He was a capable man when he was not trying to be something larger than his actual circumstances warranted. And capable men who have been reduced by experience to their actual size sometimes do better work than they did when they were larger. Lucinda managed the adjustment with the competence she brought to everything which was considerable, even when what she was managing was a reduced version of what she had previously managed. She did not speak publicly about what the winter had been, or what she had done, or what she had learned from it. She was not a woman who processed things publicly. She was a woman who processed things and then applied what she had processed, and the application was visible without requiring comment. On a morning in late April, when the road east of town had become passable, but the fields were still mostly white, she walked the 2 miles to Marta's cabin. She came alone as she had come in February, on foot as she had come in February, but the circumstances were different. The cold was not trying to kill her this time. The ground was soft under her boots, and the air had the particular smell of snowmelt and thawing earth that is one of the more redemptive smells available to a person who has been through a Montana winter. She carried nothing. Marta was in the yard. Of course she was. Marta was always in motion when there was light to work by, and the April light was returning in the generous way of Montana spring's long evenings after the compressed dark of the winter months. She was turning the garden soil with a spade, working the first rows of the season, and she looked up when she heard the sound of boots on the road. She straightened and waited. Lucinda stopped at the edge of the yard. She looked at Marta. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the yard where the drying racks had stood through the summer, and the smokehouse that still carried the smell of last year's venison in its walls. She looked at all of it for a moment, the whole enterprise of what this woman had built, and what it had meant, and what she herself had said and done in relation to it. Then she looked at Marta and she said quietly, "How did you know?" Marta looked at her for a moment. Then she looked back down at the soil she had been turning, and she pressed the spade into the earth again with the particular motion of someone resuming something they had not finished. "I didn't know," she said. "I just remembered." Lucinda stood there for a moment longer. She nodded in the way of someone accepting an answer that is complete and does not require elaboration. Then she turned and walked back down the road toward town. That was the whole of it. No speech. No extended accounting of what had gone wrong in July, and what had been understood in February, and what the winter had cost, and what it had taught. No public reckoning in front of witnesses. 2 women in an April yard, one of them with a spade in her hand, and 8 words exchanged between them that contained everything that needed to be said. Marta watched her go. Then she went back to the garden. This is how the most important conversations end sometimes. Not with resolution and clarity and the satisfying architecture of a formally concluded dispute. With 8 words and a nod, and 2 people returning to the work that the world requires of them. The silence of revised certainty is its own kind of thunder, and you do not need to be in the room to hear it. The people who were there when Lucinda Hargrove walked 2 miles on foot to ask how Marta Elgrin knew and heard what Marta said, and watched Lucinda nod and walk away, understood what had happened without needing it explained. The summer of 1887 was the summer that Gallatin Valley tried to understand what had happened to it. The process of understanding was not quick and it was not clean. The ranchers who had borrowed to expand were dealing with the mechanics of financial collapse, which is a process that is both very slow and very fast. In different ways, slow in the accumulation of decisions that lead to it, and fast in the moment when the structure gives way. The banks were patient, but not indefinitely patient. The land changed hands through the summer in the steady, unremarkable way of transactions that have already been decided and are being formalized. Millstone Crossing survived. Towns can survive the collapse of the economy that built them, if the people in them have enough other resources to remain functional, until the economy reconstitutes itself in some new form. Millstone Crossing had people who had put food away for the winter, and those people were still there in the spring, to be the foundation of what came next. 11 families, 31 children who had eaten through the hard months because a woman had calculated their probable shortfall in a journal and stored for it. That is what the survival of Millstone Crossing rested on at its most basic. A journal and a pit 8 feet deep, and a woman who had spent a summer being called crazy while she filled it. Marta sent a letter to Helena in early June. It was a careful letter measured in the way of someone who has thought about what to say and has decided to say only what is necessary. She told her grandmother that the winter had been as bad as the old woman had described, that it had lasted from November to May, that it had destroyed most of the cattle operations in the valley. She told her that the provisions she had stored had been sufficient, that the families she had planned for had come to her, as she had expected they would, and that she had fed them through. She told her grandmother that the 7 months had been right. She did not write what she was feeling when she wrote that. She did not have words for it, and even if she had, she would not have been certain the words were the right ones to put in a letter. She was not certain the feeling was grief exactly, though grief was part of it. It was something more compound. The satisfaction of having been correct about something terrible. The exhaustion of having been correct about it while carrying it alone through the preparation months and the winter months and the spring months of rationing and arithmetic and self-denial. The particular ache of loving someone who taught you something essential, and knowing that the proof of the teaching had arrived too late for that someone to witness it firsthand. The letter went to Helena in the care of a supply wagon driver who was making the trip in early June. Grandmother Lindqvist read it at her son's farm near Helena on a morning in mid-June, sitting at the kitchen table with her son's wife, reading it aloud to her, because her eyes could no longer make out the handwriting at the size Marta wrote. She listened to the whole of it without interrupting. Then she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, the twisted hands that had done 50 years of the work that old country winters required, and her clouded eyes showed something that her face did not bother to arrange itself into for the benefit of observers. She asked her son's wife to read it again, not because she had not heard it the first time, because she wanted to hear it twice. She died in the second week of July, peacefully in the room she had been given at her son's farm, in the manner of very old people who have finished what they came to do. She was 84 years old. She had lived through the famine of 1867, and the crossing of an ocean, and the building of a life in a country that was not the country she was born in. And she had passed what she knew through the person who needed it most at the moment it was most needed. And the proof that the passing had worked was in a letter that had been read to her twice on a June morning. Her family buried her in the Helena Cemetery on a Thursday. Marta arrived on the Friday, having ridden 2 days when she heard the news. She stood at the grave in the new-turned earth and looked at the stone they had placed, which said the years and the name and nothing else, because nothing else was needed by the people who would visit it. She stood there for the time that was right to stand there. Then she got back on her horse and rode the 2 days home and went directly to the garden which needed tending and tended it. This is how Marta Elgren mourned the people she loved, by doing the thing they had taught her to do, by doing it well, by doing it with the understanding that the doing was a form of continuation, that the knowledge passed from hand to hand across the years was alive in the doing of it, and that the best way to honor a teacher was to be a student who made the lesson last. She planted her fall garden that August, larger than the previous one, because she had learned in the winter of 1886 that what she had planned for had not been quite sufficient, and she had revised upward. She began her hunting in June rather than August, getting ahead of the summer heat and building the dried meat stores earlier than she had the year before. She extended the pit by 4 feet in August, adding storage space she had not had the previous year, lining the extension with the same careful layering of straw and sawdust and wood that had kept the temperature constant through the winter. She was still, by any external measure, a woman working alone on a modest claim east of Millstone Crossing. She was still, to people who did not know the full story, somewhat peculiar, somewhat excessive in her preparations, somewhat difficult to categorize. The story of what had happened in the winter of 1886 was passing through the community in the way that stories pass piece by piece, different versions emphasizing different details, the full shape of it only becoming clear when enough pieces were placed alongside each other. Declan Pruner had known the full shape of it since February. He was a farmer on the north side of the valley, a quiet man of 35 who had come to Montana from Wisconsin in 1880, and who had built a modest operation through the 7 years since by the same method that Marta had used, which was to match his ambitions precisely to his resources, and not to exceed them in either direction. He had stored food through the summer of 1886, for the same reasons Marta had not, because anyone had told him to, and not because he had read the signs in the same way she had, but because his father in Wisconsin had always stored food, and his father's father had always stored food, and this was simply the way that a person who takes winters seriously approaches the question. He had come through the winter of 1886 with his own stores intact and his own family fed, and he had known about Marta, because people in a valley know about each other. And in January, when the Henderson family and the Miller family and the others had begun making their way east of town, he had understood what was happening without needing to be told. He had ridden past her cabin one evening in February, not stopping, just passing on the road that ran by, and he had seen through the lit window a woman at the table measuring and distributing and calculating her journal, open in front of her, her hands moving with the deliberate efficiency of someone who has run this particular process many times and knows exactly what each step requires. He had kept writing, but he had thought about it for a long time afterward. And what he had thought was that he had never seen anything that looked more like competence or more like a particular kind of love than what he had seen through that window on a February night. He came to the cabin in April when the roads were passable and the social conventions that govern how a widower approaches a widow in a small Montana town permitted an approach. He did not come with any obvious purpose. He came with a question about whether she had found a good source for seed potatoes in the valley, which was a reasonable question to ask in April, of a person who had clearly been buying potatoes in bulk from most of the available sources and which served as a reasonable entry point for a conversation that became a second conversation, and then a third. By the fall of 1887, Declan Pruner was helping Marta extend the pit. By the spring of 1888, he was not riding home from her cabin at the end of the workday. By the fall of 1889, they were married in a small ceremony at the Lutheran church in Millstone Crossing, attended by the families she had fed. Through the winter of 1886, all of them present, the Henderson children and the Miller children and the Johnson children, and Callum Weathers, who was now 11 years old, and who had not stopped paying the kind of attention he had paid that first day in the cabin. The attention of someone who is not merely watching but storing. They built a larger root cellar together that summer. Not a pit exactly. Something more engineered, more considered, with the accumulated knowledge of what had worked in the previous pit and what had almost not been enough. It went 10 feet down instead of 8. It was divided into sections for different types of provisions, each section insulated at the appropriate level for what it held. It had a drainage system for the spring melt and a ventilation approach that Marta had worked out over 2 winters of observation, an approach to keeping the air moving enough to prevent spoilage without losing the temperature consistency that made the whole system work. It held 2,000 pounds when full. Marta and Declan filled it every fall. They filled it in the summer of 1889 and the summer of 1890, and every summer after that, as reliably and as deliberately as the calendar turned and the hunting seasons opened and the garden reached its harvest. They had 4 children. Each child was taught from the time they could hold a jar or carry a sack that the provisions in the root cellar were not merely food. They were a calculation. They were a decision made in summer about who would survive the winter, and the decision had to be remade every year because the winter did not remember what you had done the year before. Callum Weathers grew up and stayed in the Gallatin Valley. He took over his family's farm when his father's health declined in the early 1900s, and he ran it the way Marta had taught him, through action rather than instruction, which is the most durable form of teaching. He stored for 7 months. He stored for the families around him as well as for himself, in the way he had watched Marta store, keeping a list in a journal and adjusting the quantities to account for what his neighbors probably had and what they probably would need. He married in 1901, a woman named Ruth who had grown up in Nebraska and who had her own understanding of what winters could do. And they had 3 children who learned the same things he had learned through the same method he had learned them. In the summer of 1926, Callum Weathers was 48 years old. His oldest boy, Thomas, was 17 that summer, at the age where a young man is learning the skills that will determine the shape of his adult life. They were digging the annual extension of the root cellar, adding a section Callum had been planning for 2 years, and Thomas was working with the methodical precision his father had always modeled. measuring carefully, digging clean edges, doing the work right, rather than doing it fast. He asked his father at some point in the afternoon how he had learned to do all of this. Not just the digging, all of it. The calculations, the lists, the specific way of thinking about winter as a thing that required active preparation rather than reactive response. Callum Weathers straightened up from the work and looked at his son for a moment. He thought about how to answer that. And he thought about a January evening in 1887, when he had been 9 years old and had stood in a small cabin and watched a woman open a trapdoor and feed his family from what was in the darkness below, and about the way she had moved through the work of feeding 12 families with the undramatic efficiency of someone who had thought about this exact situation long enough that the execution of it required no extra energy, only the work itself. He told his son about Marta Elgren, not just the winter, all of it. The summer of buying potatoes and being called crazy. The journal with the lists of families. The February night when the woman who had tried to stop her from preparing knocked on the door and what Marta had done when she opened it. He told it in the order it happened without skipping the hard parts, because the hard parts were where the lesson was. From a woman, he said, who buried 600 pounds of food under her floor, while everyone in town called her crazy. She did not do it for herself. She did it for the families she knew would need it. She did it in the summer when no one believed the winter was coming. And she did it without telling anyone what she was doing or why, because she understood that the doing was the thing and the explaining was not necessary. He looked at his son, who had the particular expression of someone who has been told something they will not forget. Remember that he said, when someone calls you crazy for being ready. Thomas Weathers put it in his own journal that evening. Not those exact words. His own version of them, the version a 17-year-old puts in a journal. When something has gotten into him and he wants to make sure it stays. The entry was short. He was not a literary young man, but the idea was in it complete and intact. The thing his father had given him from the woman his father had watched through a lit window in February of 1887. Marta Elgren's cabin stood until 1923. It was pulled down that year to make room for a new farmhouse on the same property which had passed through several owners since Marta and Declan had sold it in 1908 to move to a larger claim further up the valley. The crew that pulled it down was a crew of 4 men who had been contracted to demolish the structure and clear the site, and they worked through the job with the efficiency of men who have done this kind of work before and do not attach particular significance to the structures they take apart. When they pulled up the flooring, they found the pit, not the larger root cellar that Declan and Marta had built together after their marriage, which was a separate structure and had been used and known about, and had long since been emptied and sealed. The original pit, the one Marta had dug alone in June of 1886, 8 feet into the Montana clay lined with straw and sawdust and wooden planks. It was still intact. 37 years had passed and the structure of it was still sound. The planks still holding their shape in the particular way of wood that has been kept at a stable temperature, in a stable environment, neither dried out by heat nor rotted by excessive moisture. One of the crew looked down into the darkness and shook his head. They filled it in and built over it because that is what you do when you are building something new in a place where something old was, and the old thing is not the thing you are building for. No record was made of what they found. It was not the kind of thing that made records, but the story was already in the valley. Had been in the valley for nearly 40 years. By then passed from the people who had been in the cabin in the winter of 1886 to their children, and from their children to whoever would listen, the way useful stories pass when the people who carry them understand that the story is not merely an account of what happened, but an instruction for what to do. In Millstone Crossing, which had simplified itself to crossing in the years after the boom collapsed, and the grandiose name that the boom had seemed to warrant became something people used with a certain wry awareness of what it implied. They still told the story in the places where stories get told. At the cooperative, at the grain elevator, at the bar that had been in the same building on the main street since 1879. They told it in pieces, different people knowing different parts, and the full shape of it assembled itself for whoever was patient enough to stay and listen. The phrase that had attached itself to the lesson. The phrase that people in crossing used when someone wrote off a neighbor too quickly or dismissed a preparation as excessive or decided that common sense was sufficient protection against what the world could do, was this: do not make the Hargrove mistake. It was not a cruel phrase. It was not said with the intention of diminishing the Hargrove family, most of whom had long since moved away from the valley and rebuilt their lives in the particular way that people rebuild lives when they have been reduced to the actual size of what they are, rather than what they imagined themselves to be. It was said as a reminder of a specific era, the era of confusing what civilization promised with what winters delivered, the era of allowing the confidence of a good summer to determine the preparations made for the winter that followed it. Do not make the Hargrove mistake. Know what can happen. Store for what can happen, not for what usually happens. And when the woman who is storing correctly is standing in your way, get out of her way. There is one more thing to say about Marta Elgren, about what she left in the valley and what the valley kept. The root cellar she and Declan built together in 1889 outlasted the cabin by many years. It was discovered and used by subsequent owners of the property who found it a useful structure and maintained it and extended it further in the 1910s when a new family took the land and recognized what they had. By the 1920s, it was a significant facility large enough to provision a substantial operation through any winter the territory could produce. On one of the walls of the oldest section in the section that Marta and Declan had built, first, someone had scratched something into the wood of the planking at about shoulder height, not prominently, not in a location that announced itself. It was in the back corner, the kind of place a person puts something they want to keep for themselves and whoever else takes the trouble to look. The family that found it in 1912 could read Swedish, which was fortunate because that is the language it was written in. They copied it out in their family journal in the English translation that the father made sitting at the kitchen table with the Swedish dictionary and the patience of a man who understood that the words were worth the effort. What Marta had written in the corner of a root cellar, in the Montana clay in Swedish at some point in the years when she was filling that cellar with the provisions that would matter when the winter came, was this: my grandmother told me to store for 7 months. She knew what winters could do because she had seen what they could do. I store for 7 months because she remembered and because she told me and because I listened to people who have seen things I have not yet seen. If you are reading this, you have found what I built. I hope it is enough for what you need. I hope you remembered to fill it. Below that, in a different hand in English, someone had added a single line. The handwriting was a child's handwriting, careful and deliberate, each letter placed with the concentration of someone who is writing something they intend to stay. Callum Weathers, age 11, 1889. She fed my family when the snow would not stop. I will not forget. The civilization that Lucinda Hargrove had trusted in the summer of 1886. The trains and the telegraphs and the infrastructure of American expansion across the western territories that civilization had proved in the winter of 1886 to be conditional. Conditional on weather. Conditional on the snow not being too deep and the cold not being too long, and the assumptions underlying the supply networks remaining operative under the conditions they were built to handle, and not the conditions they were not. Marta Elgren had not trusted in conditional things. She had trusted in the clay 8 feet down, that held its temperature regardless of what the surface did. She had trusted in the dried meat that asked nothing of anyone except the summer labor of a woman with a knife and a smokehouse. She had trusted in the arithmetic of her grandmother's memory, carried across an ocean, from a country that had learned what winners could do, because it had no choice but to learn. She had been called crazy for trusting in these things. She had been called crazy by a woman who was still alive in the spring because of what those things contained, and who had said so in 8 words in an April yard before walking back to town. Civilization is a word. Winter is real. Debt is real. Hunger is real. The people who understood the difference between what sounds reasonable in a good year and what keeps you alive in a bad one are the people whose grandchildren are still here. They are the people who dug 8 feet into the earth and lined it and filled it, who got up before sunrise in June to salt meat that would not be needed until January, who rode 30 miles to buy turnips from strangers because the people nearby had been told not to sell to them. They are the people who, when the knock came on the cold door in February, opened it, not because they owed anything to the person knocking, not because the person knocking had earned it or deserved it or had behaved in any way that created an obligation. They opened it because a child had not eaten since yesterday, and the provisions in the pit were there for exactly this moment, had always been there for exactly this moment. And the point of building something is to use it when the use arrives. Store for 7 months. Do not let anyone tell you that is too much. And when the door knocks in February, open it. That is the whole of the lesson. It is still true. It was always true. It will be true the next time the sky turns the color of iron and the temperature drops, and the things that civilization promised turn out to be contingent on conditions that winter does not honor. The ground remembers cold. The people who remember that the ground remembers cold are the people the others come to when the cold arrives. Be one of those people.